Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm KERVIN, President of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at Sentinel, and those of you listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today we are hosting a debate on statewide ballot measure 90 open primaries. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are AARP, Barron Liebman, Iberdrola Renewables, Perkins Coie, Portland General Electric, and Providence Health and Services. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. I'd also like to welcome the elected officials in the room with us today. City Commissioner Nick Fish, State Representative Lou Fredericks, and School Board Member Bobby Regan. Join us next week for the U.S. Senate debate. We have invited both Jeff Merkley and Monica Webby to debate on October 24th. If one of them does not show, the other has the stage and an opportunity for questions and answers with the audience. On October 31, we are thrilled to host the program Spooky Campaign Tales, a roast to the 2014 campaign season moderated by Sarah Merck. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, PDXCITYCLUB.org. We will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. Now we are ready to move to the program. I will be moderating today's debate on statewide ballot measure 90. The certified ballot title is Changes General Election Nomination Processes, provides for a single primary ballot listing candidates, and the top two advance to the general election ballot. I want to share with you statements from each campaign about Measure 90. First, from the Yes on Measure 90 campaign. It allows over 650,000 Oregon voters who are currently locked out of the primary process to fully participate and will result in elected officials who are more accountable to all of us, not just a small number of the most partisan voters who currently participate in primaries. And now from the No on Measure 90 campaign. The broad and diverse Protect Our Vote coalition urges a no on Measure 90, which would dramatically change our elections and limit voters' choice. While many voters feel unhappy with our current election system, this top two proposal fixes none of our current problems and actually makes many worse. The debate today will have several sections. First, each representative will give a 3-minute opening statement in an order previously determined. Following the opening statements, representatives will respond to questions written in advance of this meeting by City Club's Friday Forum and research committees, City Club staff, as well as questions submitted by each campaign. These questions were not shared with the representatives in advance. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. Keeping time at our debate today is Tom Bluth, current policy associate at the City Club of Portland. And at the conclusion of questions, each representative will make a 2-minute closing statement. Audience, please be respectful of the representatives and please hold all applause until the end of the program. Representing Yes on Measure 90 is Jim Kelly, a native Oregonian who founded Rejuvenation House Parts and is the chief petitioner of Measure 90. Representing no on Measure 90 is Dan MEEK, a public interest attorney who represents utility ratepayers, nonprofit organizations, ballot measure proponents, and political parties. And now if I could please invite the representatives to the stage. Jim Kelly, your opening statement.
Thank you, City Club members, radio listeners, and television viewers. I appreciate the opportunity to ask you to vote yes on Measure 9. Dr. Martin Luther King said the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. He could have made the same point by saying the arc of democracy bends towards inclusion. At the beginning, our democracy was limited to white male property owners. It took 100 years to drop the property requirement. After the Civil War ended slavery, voting was nominally extended to black males, but poll taxes and literacy tests blocked its exercise in many states. And a century ago, the electorate doubled when women won the right to vote. The arc toward inclusion didn't stop there. In the 1960s, poll taxes and literacy tests were struck down. In the 70s, the voting age was moved from 21 to 18. And here in Oregon, we've added online voter registration and vote by mail. Voting yes on ballot measure 90 is a natural extension of this arc. Voting yes on Measure 90 will let all registered voters fully participate in the May primary election, where about 90% of the final outcomes are determined. 687,000 Oregon voters who are non-affiliated or registered with minor parties are currently locked out of partisan primaries. Voting yes on Measure 90 will fix that. Voting yes on Measure 90 will also mean that 300,000 Oregon voters whose primary votes don't mean much today because they are a Democrat in rural Oregon or a Republican in Portland will have meaningful votes again. Let's have every vote count. Our closed primary system made sense when nearly all voters registered with a major party. In 1960, 2% of Oregon voters belonged to a minor party or were unaffiliated. Today, that number stands at 32%. 32%. And nearly half of voters under 40 choose not to affiliate with the major parties. Since June of this year, 74% of newly registered voters have rejected the major parties. 74%. To exclude those voters from meaningful participation in our democracy is just not right. It's not democracy. Let's have every vote count. If we keep going down the path we are on, the next generation will become disgusted with politics and choose to opt out. We cannot afford to let that happen to our democracy. Now is the time to start fixing our broken political system. Please vote yes on Measure 90. Let's have every vote count.
I'd like to remind the audience to please hold your applause until the end of the program today. Dan Meeks, your opening statement. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. The last time I was here was in 2006 advocating for 2 campaign finance reform measures. Measure 90, on the other hand, is a very clever plan that would increase the power of big money donors to political campaigns by effectively destroying the meaning of party labels on the ballot. The big money donors have already put $4 million into this campaign for Measure 90. The biggest funder is John Arnold, former Enron energy trader and Texas billionaire, who's already ponied up $1.5 million. You may recall the Enron energy traders were the folks who brought us the phony West Coast energy crisis with rolling blackouts and over $40 billion of damage to the California economy. I'd like to offer 6 reasons to oppose Measure 90. First, it would eliminate 5 of Oregon's 7 minor parties. The Oregon Citizens Review Committee voted 14-5 to oppose this measure, in part because, quote, Measure 90 has several significant drafting errors. The most significant appears to eliminate minor parties. And it's quite ironic what Jim said about the arc of history, about slavery, about giving the vote to women, because it was minor parties who first demanded the end to slavery. That minor party was called the Republicans. It was a minor party who first demanded that women be allowed to vote. That was called the Progressive Party about 100 years ago. So it's ironic that they would be proposing a measure that will substantially destroy the minor parties in Oregon when those are the parties that actually take the positions that Jim seems to advocate. But also note that this City Club study in 2008 unanimously recommended the rejection of a measure that was virtually identical to this measure in 90. I checked, it's 98% the same. Second, even if the minor parties survive, top 2 in California and Washington resulted in 0 minor party candidates on the general election ballot. None. Also, 0 minor party candidates in congressional and legislative races, except where only 1 major party candidate runs in the primary. If 2 major party candidates are in any way interested, whether it's 1D, 1R, or 2 of both, the minor party is totally shut out of the election, of all partisan elections in California and Washington. Oregon this year has 55 unique minor party candidates on the November ballot. Before top 2, California averaged 133 minor party candidates on the November ballot. This year, that's dropped to a grand total in California of 1. 133 down to 1. Third, Measure 90 forecloses Measure 90 makes the ability of any candidate to advance the November election dependent upon how many other candidates of the same party enter the same primary race and thus split the vote of adherents. California Congressional District 31, heavily Democratic district. 4 Democrats ran in the primary, 2 Republicans. Guess what happened? The 2 Republicans won, and for the first time in history, California District 31 was forced to elect a Republican to Congress.
We will now move to the portion of the program where I will ask questions prepared in advance of the debate. I will give both representatives an opportunity to respond to the same question as well as ask representatives different questions. Jim Kelly, why was this the nonpartisan primary reform you chose rather than the Montana open primary approach of sending a Democratic and GOP ballot to every voter and letting them decide? You have 90 seconds.
Well, we designed this to work for the voters. Voters first, not parties or special interests first. And there are many, many, many different forms of electoral reform. But this is one that allows lots more choice in the primary, allows all party endorsements where they can endorse and those endorsements actually show up on the ballot, multiple endorsements, expands what we have as Oregon law right now to endorsements both in the primary and in the general election, but also with just 2 candidates, in the general election, we don't have the chance that we can elect people who in a situation where we have a spoiler. Because if you have 3 or 4 people in that general election ballot, you have the opportunity for a spoiler and for someone to be elected whose views really aren't in line with the majority of voters in that district. Think about Ralph Nader. Think what happens in that kind of situation. And our duty in coming in and trying to remodel the electoral system, our first duty is to democracy. And democracy means that candidate who is most representative of the district should be the one who is elected. We have other duties. We do have duties that people can vote their conscience. They can do that with a write-in. But our main duty is to make sure we have a democratic process that is democratic and elects the leaders most representative of their district.
Dan Meek, if not Measure 90, how do we address and fix the issues with our current process? You have 90 seconds.
What some folks may not realize is that Oregon is already in a unique position when it comes to party primaries. Back in 2006, some of my friends and I created the Independent Party of Oregon, which now has 104,000 members. As soon as it gains another 4,000 members, which should happen by the end of this year, it will be Oregon's third major party. And we'll have a primary election in May of 2016, just like the other major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The leadership of the Independent Party is unanimous in wanting to open its primary not only to the 100,000 or so Independent Party members, but also to the 500,000 or so non-affiliated voters, which we call NAVs. That will make the Independent Party primary in 2016 just as big as the Republican primary in terms of the number of eligible voters. And it negates the primary complaint that the proponents make about the current system, that 650,000 people are locked out of the primary. They're not going to be locked out of any primary in Oregon in the future because they will all be able to vote in the Independent Party of Oregon primary. And I would ask any of the prominent folks in this room who are considering challenging the political establishment in 2016 to think about running as a candidate of the Independent Party in the Independent Party primary. In order to do so, you need to change your voter registration sometime in the next couple of years.
This question is from the No on Measure 90 campaign to the Yes on Measure 90 campaign. Jim Kelly, under the top two system, major party leaders must discourage legitimate candidates from running in order to avoid vote splitting. Washington State Democratic Party Chair Dwight Peltz was quoted in 2010 as saying, "I, as party chair, have to go and talk people into not participating, and I think that's really unfortunate." Why should major party leaders be forced into discouraging candidates from running? You have 60 seconds.
Well, today, again, I'll go right back to that this initiative is written to serve voters first, not parties first. And with this, when we have an open primary, the candidates who are most representative of all of the voters in their district are going to be the top two coming out of the primary, and they're going to face each other in the general election. Today we have as few, often even under 15% of the registered voters in a district actually electing someone. We have so many districts, essentially about 90% of our districts throughout the state, so dominated by the Republicans or the Democrats, that election is over when the primary is over, and 50% plus one of that very small group of voters, in other words, 7.5%, 8% of the people are electing, and nobody else in the district, their vote doesn't count.
This question is from the Yes on Measure 90 campaign to the No on Measure 90 campaign. Dan Meek, 49% of registered voters under 40 and over 114,000 seniors, these stats are from Oregon Secretary of State, September 2014, are not registered with a major party. How is the current system benefiting them since they can't participate in elections that they are paying taxes to support? You have 60 seconds.
First, they will be able to participate in all future Oregon primary elections for the reason that I just stated. They can join the Independent Party or remain non-affiliated voters and still vote for candidates in the next primary election and those succeeding that. But it's interesting that you mentioned young folks and the elderly, because another effect of Measure 90 is that it shifts important decisions from the general election, where there's much higher turnout and much higher involvement of young folks, to the primary election, where the folks, actually in Oregon, the primary election gets turnout that is generally only half of that of the general election. And the primary turnout is much more overwhelmingly white, Republican, highly educated, and high income. So it's really a very clever scheme to move important decisions to the primary election, where you've got an electorate that is really contrary, I think, to the interests of young people.
Jim Kelly, primary voters are older, whiter, and wealthier than other voters. Isn't Measure 90 intended to give those voters more influence? You have 60 seconds.
Absolutely not. And they are older, whiter, and wealthier. And actually, Measure 90 is intended to do exactly the opposite. Because what we're trying to do is not empower those voters, but to change the system so that there's more opportunity. We'll have more candidates, more minor parties represented. They're not represented at all in primaries right now. There'll be more reasons to vote in the primary. Our whole goal here is to change that so those older, whiter, wealthier voters don't control the system. With all of our dominated districts, those are the voters who are effectively electing people today and sending them to office, because the general election in so many different districts is meaningless because it's so dominated by Democrats in Portland and it's so dominated by Republicans where I live in Eastern Oregon. So the current system is enfranchising those primary voters. We need to change that, bring more people into the primary, and bring real democracy representative of all the voters in the district.
Dan Meek. The Protect Our Vote Coalition are organizations such as Planned Parenthood and Oregon League of Conservation Voters, as well as the parties in Oregon. What brings these groups together? You have 60 seconds.
I don't know. I'm not their political organizer, but I think what they're concerned about is maintaining the integrity of the meaning of party labels on the ballot. Party labels are very important. If you see Democrat on the ballot versus a Republican, it does mean something. There are differing philosophies there. Even when I look at the ballot, I vote for candidates, but mainly based upon their party identification. I hope there's some minor party candidates on the ballot, as there are 55 unique ones in Oregon in this general election ballot. But ask yourself, when you go to the ballot and you're voting particularly for something other than the top line races like president or governor, do you really know who the candidates are or what they stand for, or are you voting on the basis of party labels? Now, this measure destroys party labels. It allows anybody up to 70 days before the primary election to change their party registration to anything and then suddenly appear on the primary ballot with the name of the party next to their name. It could be a white power guy, it could be a convicted criminal, and there it is. Joe Blow, Democrat. Joe Blow, registered progressive. And there's nothing that the parties can do to get that label off of that candidate's name in the primary election. This degrades the meaning of party labels.
Jim Kelly, can you name a specific change in Oregon law that you think will be more likely to pass in a legislature elected under a top two system than under the current primary system, and explain why this should matter to Oregon voters? You have 90 seconds.
Sure, I can think of a few, but the one that just pops out is that the majority of Oregon voters believe that the minimum wage should be increased. Yet our legislature isn't moving in that direction. And part of why they're not moving in that direction is on each side they are answering to that small group of primary voters who are also the voters who can primary candidates the next time if they do not follow the party line. And so, there's a variety of positions that are essentially, you cross any of those positions if you're in the Oregon legislature right now, or if you're a congressman, as is well known, and you cross those lines, you are likely to get knocked out in the next primary. Even my congressman, Greg Walden, had to face a primary challenge. He survived that, but that's because there are many in his party who think some of his positions, believe it or not, are too liberal. Now that's not right, and that's a core to what Measure 90 will help fix, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Dan Meek, can you name a specific change in Oregon law that was passed by a recent legislature that would be unlikely to pass if Measure 90 had been in place, and explain why this should matter to Oregon voters? You have 90 seconds.
Well, I think that Measure 90 will generally move the state to the right. And so I would expect, for example, the driver's card statute that the legislature passed would not be passed under Measure 90. I would also point out that I think minimum wage has not been increased by the Oregon legislature recently because it's already the second highest minimum wage in the country, not too bad. And also because Republicans are against it. And in the Senate of Oregon, they hold an effective veto because Betsy Johnson, a Democrat, sort of the ultimate moderate Democrat, sort of the ultimate product of what the proponents of Measure 90 wants, votes with the Republicans on important issues and so defeats issues like minimum wage and other things like that. I would like to point out about competitive races that Jim emphasizes, that, oh, all the races in Oregon aren't competitive for the legislature, and it's true that some of them aren't. But top two doesn't solve that. In Oregon, over the past 2 election cycles, 26% of the races for the legislature have featured on the November ballot only one major party candidate. Obviously, in Portland, it's a Democrat. In Eastern Oregon, it's a Republican. But in Washington under top two, over the past 2 election cycles, 30% of legislative races have featured only one major party candidate. So top two doesn't solve the problem of competitiveness. You still don't have competition in the primary or general elections under top two, and top two eliminates all petition for candidates, can't get on the ballot that way, and eliminates, as we've indicated in California and Washington, all minor party candidates effectively as well. So Measure 90 will dramatically reduce choice and reduce competitiveness.
The next set of questions will be directed to both representatives. What evidence from Washington or California do you have that Measure 90 will help or hinder turnout for youth? Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
Of course, this measure is touted as one to increase turnout in the primary election, and you would think that it would. But the experience in Washington and California is exactly the opposite. Since top two was adopted in Washington in 2000, first time it was in effect in this form is 2008. Washington, by the way, for 60 years before 2004, had a much better form of top two. It was a blanket primary where everybody could vote for the same pool of candidates, but it wasn't top two. The winners were the top Democrat, the top Republican, and anyone else who got 1% of the vote in the primary election. So you, in fact, did have third parties in the general. But since Washington adopted it again and California in 2012, voter turnout in both states in the primary has fallen to record low levels. It has no positive effect on turnout. And turnout in the general elections goes way down when the voter sees on the ballot only 2 Democrats, as they will in Portland in some races, many races, or only 2 Republicans, as Jim will see in Eastern Oregon.
Jim Kelly?
So I can give you evidence in what is a really important thing, because first of all, what's been happening with turnout is that, and what Dan forgets to say, is that turnout everywhere is going down in every state, including Oregon, where we had just the second to lowest from the lowest ever in this recent primary election. So it's a little bit inappropriate to claim that that top two would actually be reducing turnout, especially because you're enfranchising, in our case, 686,000 people who are legally not able to vote today. And actually, in California, turnout's been down because there haven't really been any interesting races, and that's what really drives turnout. And same thing in Washington. But actual numbers of voters casting votes for congressional races and states by independents has increased. The actual number of votes has increased.
So the actual question focused on youth, and I'd like to ask again and ask you to address the question in terms of youth. What evidence from Washington or California do you have that Measure 90 will help or hinder turnout for youth?
I don't believe that we have specific information about youth turnout. I don't have it. I'm not in a position to make any claims about Oregon or Washington. What we know is that here in Oregon, the youth are more disenfranchised than any other group. As I said, 49%, and the number continues to grow, out of voters under 40 are not registering with the major parties. That means they can't vote. If we pass Measure 90, it stands to reason they'll have more reasons to vote, particularly in the primaries, because a lot of them, I think, are more interested. They're clearly rejecting the major parties, so they'll be more interested in participating in a system where they'll have more opportunity to vote for the people in a meaningful way, where it actually makes a difference in the primary. And so I fully expect, and that's one of the reasons we are here, but I can't say anything about Washington or California.
And Dan, back to you. The question focused on youth.
Yes.
So I'd like to hear, again, what evidence from Washington or California do you have that Measure 90 will help or hinder turnout for youth?
I have none whatsoever that would support that. In fact, I think under Measure 90, turnout in the primaries in Oregon will go down dramatically because of a unique feature of Measure 90 that's not in the California or Washington laws, and Jim mentioned it. And that is Measure 90 allows the political parties who survive, 5 of the 7 will be gone, but the ones who survive will be able to place their endorsements on the ballot. So a candidate might say, Joe Blow, registered Democrat, endorsed Democratic Party. I think that will actually discourage turnout because if you believe those endorsement lines are effective, both in the primary and general election, you've effectively eliminated the Oregon progressive reform of 1904, which was to require major parties to select their candidates by primary, giving every member of the party an equal vote. Instead, there's no process for making these endorsements. The parties can do it any way they want to. They can do it behind closed doors in smoke-filled rooms, and so you will end up essentially replacing the primary with a system of backroom deals to obtain endorsements on the ballot. Faced with that situation, I probably wouldn't vote in the primary either.
One tool the community has to increase the percentage of minorities in public office is the appointment process. Portland Public Schools did this a few years ago in appointing its first Hispanic to the school board. How would the appointment process change under Measure 90, and would it work to increase or decrease the likelihood that a minority or lesser-known candidate might have a chance? Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Okay. Specifically, it depends on the particular office, but I think in general, the replacement process for state legislators goes to county commissions. What I'd like to point out is that in California, we have really interesting evidence about what has happened with minority candidates. The number in the legislature has increased by 10%. I think it's 9 or 10 additional minorities in the legislature since the open primary was passed there. So something's going on there that is doing exactly the kind of thing that we would like to see happen.
Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
What went on in California was redistricting. California adopted a redistricting commission that dramatically changed the districts in order to reflect the increase in California's population, particularly the Hispanic population. And if you take a look at political science studies, that all of the studies indicate that that's why additional minority folks were elected to the California legislature, and it had nothing to do with top 2. As far as the appointment or replacement process, that's another problem with Measure 90 because currently, if a legislator retires or gets a new job or resigns, the replacement is chosen by the county commission involved in the district, but the county commission has to choose among folks who are of the same party as the person who is retiring. Measure 90 eliminates that, so you could have a situation like in Lane County, which elects almost always Democrats to the state legislature, but their county commission is considered to be, the folks that are considered to be, 4 of the 5 are considered to be Republicans, and under Measure 90 could replace a retiring Democratic legislator with a Republican legislator, and I tend to think that that's not going to assist the appointments for minority folks.
What do you expect the measure will do to the cost of the average Portland State House and Senate race? Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
I would expect it to double because you'll have the same candidates running against each other in the primary and in the general election, and in Portland they will both be Democrats. That's another very clever feature of this measure. Because of demography, Democrats are more closely packed together in urban areas. Republicans tend to be spread out. So in Oregon, there are several districts, if you just look at Democrats and Republicans alone, that are more than 80% Democratic registration. There are some House districts that are more than 90% Democratic registration here in Portland. Under top 2, those districts will certainly advance 2 Democrats to the general election. And that means that those Democrats are going to be spending money against each other and fighting against each other, as they are doing in California, where a lot of money is going to Democrat versus Democrat races. This doesn't happen so much with Republicans. Their base is spread out. There are no districts in Oregon that are more than, in the Senate, 65% Republican, for example, so there will still be Democratic candidates there. So top two is a way to force Democratic candidates to fight each other all the way through the general election and spend a lot of money doing that so they have less money to spend against their philosophical opponents.
Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Sure. I would expect that the cost of those races will either stay the same or could even go down. And here's why. Because right now, there's just a small number of races that are competitive. Ask any political, and they know that when you come down to the general election, because most of them have been settled in that primary because of the domination in these various districts. And so right now, huge amounts of money, and the amount of money has doubled in the last 10 years, gets spent on very few races. When we make more races competitive, and when we're talking about money here, let's be clear. We're talking here about more democracy, more competitive races, not people who are, not candidates who can get into office with just 7 or 8, only talking to 7 or 8% of the voters in the district. Under the open primary, those candidates have to talk to all the voters in that district. Yes, that costs money, but that's what democracy is all about, having competitive races, talking to all the voters in the district. It's just indefensible to say, oh, well, it's going to cost more money because it's a great system when just this tiny slice of older, whiter, wealthier people can elect people to office.
Would each of you tell us how you are raising dollars to support your campaign and how that fundraising benefits the voters in Oregon? Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Sure. You know, we went out and raised money all in Oregon, and a lot of it was from business people, almost. And the other side will talk about big corporations. There's no Monsanto, there's no Exxon, there's no Comcast. These are all business people like myself who built businesses here in Oregon, who see the need for the fact we have to have a functioning government. And when they see partisan bickering getting in the way of that, I think business people recognize they need, we need roads, we need immigration policies that work at the federal level for farmers. So business people are the ones who primarily helped raise the money, almost $500,000 to get it onto the ballot. We had 140,000 Oregon voters who signed our petitions. And we have totally focused up until now raising money from people in Oregon. And we have some people from the outside who want to help us now. I welcome their help.
Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
Wow. Measure 90's 70% of the campaign is being funded by two individuals, former Enron energy trader John Arnold, I've already mentioned, and the second largest donor is New York billionaire Michael Bloomberg. In addition, the contributions to the yes side are basically a lot of corporations. They are banks, utilities, car dealerships, timber companies, a lot of private investment companies and private investment managers, hedge fund managers, and a lot of scions of inherited wealth. The no side, on the other hand, I'm not in any way in charge of fundraising. I'm a volunteer. And the no side is being outspent so far 10-1 by the yes side. The no side's funding is coming primarily from public employee unions in Oregon. But I think much of the effort on the no side is like me, volunteers. We're not paid, it's not reported on Orstar, and so the effort is hard to gauge in that way.
Knowing that here in Oregon we have very little representation of people of color in our government, how will this change affect racial representation in our political process? Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
I don't know that it would have an effect, except that it would shift important decisions to an older, whiter, and more Republican electorate in November. And would also essentially in May, it would also effectively let that population determine who wins in November. For example, in races in Portland, where you might find the greatest likelihood of obtaining racial diversity in candidates and elected officials, if you have two Democrats on the ballot, who's going to decide who wins in November? It's probably going to be the Republicans, the remaining Republicans, because the Democratic vote will be split between the two Democrats, which leaves the other folks to decide who wins. And I got to say, I think having minority representation in public office is probably going to be reduced by that system. And keep in mind that it's very important that these folks be able to have a say in November, and it's going to be the older, whiter Republicans who decide whether they even make it to the ballot in November.
Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Sure. You know, Dan, in all these situations, he's having to defend the status quo. And the status quo, as we all know, is so not working for us, particularly back in Washington, D.C. And here's an issue, right, with the status quo in Oregon. We have 20% of Oregonians who are minorities. How many legislators do we have in the House that are minorities, in the House and the Senate that are minorities out of 90 legislators? Three. The number, well, 3, 5. The number I've got is 3. If it's 5, wonderful. It still isn't even remotely close to what we should be. So do we want to just stick with the status quo, or do we want to have some opportunity to change things like they did in California? And Dan's right, redistricting is part of what caused their situation where they do have more minorities in the legislature. We are failing minorities in the legislature right now, and we need to make the kind of changes that will help fix that.
I want you to imagine your side wins this November. Please give us a plausible view of the future you see in terms of what Oregon politics and elections will look like 20 years from now. What do you see happening? And if it's different than today, what caused it to change? Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Sure. I think we're going to be electing people who are better able to be problem solvers, both at the federal level and, again, at the local level. Right now, these politicians, we just had Jim Thompson. He was a Republican legislator here in Oregon, and one of the members of the coalition that's fighting Measure 90 is Oregon Right to Life. Oregon Right to Life, Jim Thompson apparently came out in support of gay marriage. So they said, this is not good. They went in and they primaried. They got rid of him because all they had to talk to was that very small band of older, whiter, wealthier current primary voters. And they got rid of him. So people, I think what we see, and we've seen this in California for sure, we've also seen it in Washington, where in those cases, when the government was shut down, half the congresspeople in California voted to end the shutdown. The Republicans, I should say, 8 out of 16, and all 4 Republicans out of Washington. They could do that safely.
Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
I see in the future that the Independent Party of Oregon will dominate Oregon politics because of the voters' desire to, for lack of a better term, throw the bums out. Unless you have a viable third major party, however, all that you can do in a general election is switch from one set of bums to another set of bums. But if you have a third major party, you can throw them both out and elect independent party candidates. In addition, as far as problem solvers go, you all think the state of Washington is a lot better off now than it was before Top 2? I don't know of any reason to think so. Is it better off than Oregon because of Top 2? I don't think there's any reason to believe that either.
If the 2008 presidential primaries across the country had been conducted with Top 2 primaries, Americans would have been asked in November to choose between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, as the Republican vote was split among so many candidates. Talk us through what problems this solves or issues it brings up. Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
Well, I think it's a major problem because it makes the election system really a system of games that are manipulable by political operatives. Let me give you an example. In California, I believe it's the 31st congressional district this year, there was a candidate, Ro Khanna, who was accused of recruiting, he was a Democrat, in top 2 primary for Congress, is accused of recruiting Republican candidates to run in his primary, specifically in order to split up the Republican vote so that he could proceed to win and go on to the November election. The accusation is he even went so far as to recruit a Republican candidate with almost the same name as the leading Republican candidate. The leading Republican candidate was Vanilla Singh, a Sikh. So he recruited someone named Vinesh Singh to run in the primary election. So that's what happens under top 2. Under top 2, it's the only system I know of where your ability to win and proceed to the general election depends upon how many other candidates identified with the same party run in the primary election and split up your vote. So playing dirty tricks is definitely rewarded under top 2.
Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
A lot of dirty tricks are rewarded in the current system. This is politics. None of it is perfect by any means. You know, the other side really struggles to come up with these examples of what has not worked in California under top 2. And what's interesting about that is that there's been like 360 races that have been run, and really only one with a result that would be arguably a bad result. And that fixed is in the process of self-correcting 2 years later. At the same time, here in Oregon, look around. We are surrounded by bad results. In rural areas like mine, we send, because of the way that primary system works, we send rural legislators to Salem constantly who are essentially close, either Tea Party or close to being Tea Party people, because they have been hand-selected by that party and they're only having to answer to a very small group of people. We're getting very bad results, and when people get primaried out on these issues like Jim Thompson did, it's a very bad result. Plenty of bad results in the current system.
Opponents argue that the possibility of having 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats running against each other in a general election under Measure 90 would reduce choice, yet Measure 90 proponents argue that it could be a very good thing and help elect more reasonable candidates. Which is true? Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Sure. Well, let me give you the example of what's happened up in Washington, in District 4 up there. There was a congressman up there who retired. And they have the open primary, so they had a lot of people run against each other. We ended up with 2 Republicans who are now going to run against each other. One of them, Mr. Didier, who used to be a football player, and he's a Tea Party guy. And he says, I'll go back there and raise hell. The other guy, Mr. Newhouse, was previously the head of the Department of Agriculture up there, appointed by a Democratic governor. They're both really conservative. Don't get me wrong. They're both very conservative guys. The district is very conservative. But up there, people will be able to, the people like me who live in districts like that, I'm a Democrat, will be able to vote, and I strongly suspect that Mr. Newhouse will win. Do we want to send Tea Party people back there, or do we want to send more reasonable candidates? Sending a Tea Party guy is just not the Oregon way.
Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
I would characterize both of those Washington candidates as Tea Party, so it doesn't make any difference, except that now in Washington, in that district, Democrats will face a ballot with 2 Republicans. Top 2 studies have indicated that it actually increases the opportunity for extremist candidates to advance to the general election. And that's because in the primary election, particularly in open seats, a lot of establishment, lower-level politicians, moderate folks get into the race. They split the vote of the moderate vote and allow extremists to proceed to the general election. One example is in Louisiana, which has had this system for many decades, which has twice advanced neo-Nazi white power candidate David Duke to the general election in statewide elections, most prominently against a convicted bribery guy, Edwin Edwards, back a few years ago. You may recall that the slogan of his supporters in that race was, vote for the crook, it's important. That's what top 2 does.
We asked the campaigns to each submit 10 questions for the debate. We will ask the rest of those questions until it's time for closing statements. The first question was submitted from the Yes on Measure 90 campaign. In 2008, all the minor parties opposed the open primary initiative that was on the ballot. This time, some minor parties still oppose, yet both the Working Families Party and the Independent Party have endorsed Measure 90. Those two parties represent 110,000 of the 150,000 minor party voters in Oregon. What has changed? Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
What has changed with the Working Families Party, I can't say. Because I'm co-chair of the Independent Party, I can say. And that is, in 2008, we weren't organized to take positions on ballot measures. In this year, however, we did a survey of our members online and sent out email to our members and asked them to weigh in on various ballot measures. They did weigh in. Surprisingly enough, they were extremely in favor of Measure 92, labeling of GMO foods, extremely against, I think, Measure 86, which is the state bond for financing post-secondary education, and very much in favor of Measure 90. I think because the information we provided them and that they've seen is the ballot title and that sort of thing. Measure 90 is undeniably superficially attractive. The problem is once you look into what it actually does and its actual experience in Louisiana, Washington, and California, that you understand how anti-democratic it is.
Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Yeah, it's got to be pretty frustrating for Dan to have the party that he helped found now endorsing our measure. But you know, a lot has changed in the meanwhile, and I'm really proud, particularly of the Working Families Party, that they figured out that they can be actually a bigger player in the process of politics and democracy in Oregon. You know, previously, most of the parties that are minor parties, they're not electing anyone to office in Oregon. They haven't elected anybody to the legislature in independent or minor party in 40 years. The last statewide person who was independent was Julius Meyer as governor in the 1930s. So it hasn't been about actually electing people to office. But the Working Families Party, they helped create the fusion voting process, which is now part of our law, and which our Measure 90 will expand into the primaries as well as the general elections. And minor parties in this way can actually influence the candidates and really participate in a full positive way in our political system.
The next question was submitted from the No on Measure 90 campaign. When you're rewriting something as complicated as election law, you have to be careful to do it right. There are a number of flaws in Measure 90, and supporters suggest that we can just rely on the legislature to fix these. Which flaw do you think the legislature is likely to fix, and which ones do you think we're stuck with regardless of what happens? Jim Kelly, 60 seconds.
Well, the other side has made lots of claims because the other side, it's very, if you're running a campaign against an initiative, all you've got to do is instill fear, doubt, uncertainty, confusion. That's your job. And that's what they've done with all of these claims about Measure 90 being full of drafting errors. And the claims are really mostly ridiculous claims. But Measure 90 was intentionally statutory. It's not constitutional. We have seen over and over with these initiatives that are constitutional and what they have saddled us with in this state. And at least I think the people who put who wrote Measure 90, which unlike what our opposition says it's been done by lobbyists, millionaire CEOs, and big corporations, it was done by former Secretary of State Phil Keisling. He wrote this. He updated it. He wrote it, I think, originally back in about 2006. He updated it in 2008, and he updated it now. Mark Frohmeyer helped him a little bit, and the Working Families Party helped him. Nobody else.
Dan Meek, 60 seconds.
Well, if Jim thinks that our objections to Measure 90 are mostly ridiculous, I hope that he would identify specifically which ones are ridiculous. I think the ones that I've raised are legitimate. Yes, it is a statute, but it seems strange that the Yes campaign would rely upon the Oregon legislature to change things in order to rectify problems with Measure 90, like the ones that were identified by the Oregon Citizens Review Committee that would eliminate minor parties in Oregon, according to them. If you can trust the Oregon legislature to change Measure 90 in order to make it more democratic and offer a system that is good for all Oregonians, why can't you trust the Oregon legislature to do the same thing now? In addition, If voters pass this, I think that the legislators in the audience would agree with me that it's not likely that the legislature is going to contradict the will of the people very soon. If the people adopted this particular process, they will let it go into effect. And it's what's called a tipping point. Once this thing goes into effect, it's going to stay in effect because it's going to elect people who like the process under which they succeed.
We will now move to the final portion of the program, 2-minute closing statements from each candidate. Jim Kelly, 2 minutes.
I want to thank all of you for coming and for the opportunity to share my views on the benefits of voting yes on Measure 90. Across the country, in state after state, special interests are waging well-financed efforts to discourage and even intimidate voters from exercising their hard-won right to vote. We have a chance here to sweep away obstacles to voting. We have a chance to enfranchise half the voters in Oregon, particularly younger voters whose faith in American democracy is already being sorely tested. We have an opportunity to say, here in Oregon, you don't have to betray your principles. Here in Oregon, you won't have to jump through hoops to exercise your right to vote. Here in Oregon, every vote counts. But here in Oregon, we are also proud of our progressive reforms and the leaders who have created them, like Tom McCall. But today, the chance that a man or a woman like Tom McCall could be elected in a partisan primary is near zero. That's sad. I hope that disagreements in this debate about simple facts have not left you confused. But for the facts, not fear, please visit our website, yesonmeasure90.com. Learn the facts and then decide for yourself. Voting yes on Measure 90 won't fix all that ails us in politics, but this will go a long ways towards reducing partisan gridlock and make a real and positive difference for Oregon. Nearly every newspaper in Oregon has endorsed a yes vote on Measure 90, including the Oregonian and the Register-Guard. I will end with a quote from Portland Tribune's endorsement. Quote, Measure 90 comes to a ballot via citizens' initiative drive, and it is a rarity in that its objective is simply to make government work better rather than to advance some interest group's narrow or partisan cause.
Thank
Unquote.
you.
Please vote yes on Measure 90.
Dan Meek, 2 minutes.
Virtually every newspaper in Oregon also endorsed the same measure, Measure 65, in 2008. Fortunately, the voters of Oregon didn't take their advice and defeated it by a vote of 66 to 34%. Newspapers and media are going to love Measure 90 if it passes because it means campaigns are going to cost a lot more money. You're going to have to run against folks both in the primary and the general election, probably doubling the cost of many campaigns in the Portland and Eugene metropolitan areas, and that means more money, obviously, for the media. I would also point out that under Measure 90, you're not going to be able to have the kind of choices that voters in South Dakota and Kansas have right now. In those places, after their primary elections, independents have suddenly emerged in order to, and are actually leading the races for the United States Senate in Kansas and South Dakota. Top 2 would not allow that. Under Top 2, you've got only the Democrat and Republican on the general election ballot in those states, and so an independent cannot rise under Top 2. It's a very much top-down, stifling system. Finally, I would ask us all to look at Top 2, and not the rhetoric about Top 2, but look at actually the effects that it has in California and Washington. It effectively destroys the meaning of party labels on the ballot. Anybody can hijack the party label on the ballot and suddenly become the candidate of, let's say, the Progressive Party or the Green Party, people that they don't even know about. Same thing with Democrats and Republicans. I think party labels mean something. Under Top 2, they become meaningless. They only become a way to manipulate the system in order to split the votes of party adherents so that other folks can advance to the general election. It's really quite a game. And finally, I would ask that we not join with Enron energy trader John Arnold. We not join with New York billionaire Michael Bloomberg. We not join with Associated Oregon Industries and its top funder, the Koch brothers, and that we reject Measure 90. Thank you.
We have run out of broadcast time and will have to stop for the day. Please join me in offering our sincere thanks to today's guest, Jim Kelly, representing Yes on Measure 90, and Dan Meek, representing No on Measure 90.